People always say that life has a way of testing you when you least expect it. But nobody, and I mean absolutely nobody, prepares you for the kind of test that strips away everything you thought you knew about yourself, about the people you love, and about the world you believed was safe. My name is Raymond, and this is my story. I am sitting here today, looking back at the last several decades of my life, and I can barely believe what I survived. If someone had told me 30 years ago that I would be where I am today, sitting in a beautiful home, surrounded by the laughter of my grandchildren, watching my son become the man I always prayed he would be, I would have called them a liar. But here I am. And before I take you into the darkest corners of everything I have been through, I want you to understand one thing clearly. Every single thing I did, every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every moment I chose to keep going when everything inside me screamed to stop, I did it for love. Not for money, not for pride, for love. That is the only reason a man keeps standing when the world keeps knocking him down. So let me take you back to where it all began. I was young when I met Vanessa. I mean really young, the kind of young where you think you have all the answers and life has not yet had the chance to prove you wrong. She was beautiful in a way that made every room brighter the moment she walked into it. Her smile could stop a conversation cold. Her laugh could make you forget every problem you had ever carried. We were both struggling back then. I'm not going to dress it up, we were poor. Living paycheck to paycheck in a small apartment that had more cracks in the walls than it had furniture. But we had dreams. Big, beautiful, borderline, ridiculous dreams. We were going to build something together. A real life. A real home. The kind of life where our children would never have to worry about whether the lights would stay on. We talked about it constantly. Late at night when the bills were stacked on the kitchen counter and the refrigerator was running low, we would sit together and talk about the future like it already belonged to us. That is what love does to you when you are young. It makes the impossible feel inevitable. And then Adrian was born. I remember the exact moment they placed him in my arms. This tiny human being with his fingers curled into small fists and his eyes blinking slowly, like he was still deciding whether the world outside was worth the trouble. I held him and felt something shift inside me, something permanent and unbreakable. I knew right then, in that cold hospital room under those flickering fluorescent lights, that I would do absolutely anything for this child. Anything at all. Vanessa seemed happy too, at least during those first few months. There were genuine moments of joy. Adrian's first smile, his first laugh, the way he would reach up and grab my finger and hold on like he was never letting go. Those moments were everything. But slowly, quietly, things began to change. I noticed it first in the small things. The way she would go silent in the middle of conversations. The way her eyes would drift somewhere far away when she thought I was not looking. The smiles became less frequent. The laughter faded almost completely. She started coming home later, offering vague explanations about job opportunities and friends I'd never been introduced to. I was working 2 jobs at the time. Days at a warehouse, loading and unloading trucks until my back ached and my hands were raw. Nights cleaning office buildings, vacuuming long hallways, emptying trash cans, scrubbing bathrooms that belonged to people who would never know my name existed. I was exhausted in a way that went deeper than the physical. The kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones and stays there. But I kept telling myself it was temporary. Things would get better. They had to. Adrian was just 1 year and 4 months old when my world fell apart. I remember that evening like it happened this morning. I came home from my warehouse shift. Tired and hungry, my boots heavy on the stairs, I pushed open the apartment door, expecting to smell dinner or hear the television. Instead, I walked into silence. Not the peaceful kind of silence. The kind that has weight to it. The kind that presses against your chest and tells you something is very wrong before your mind is even caught up. Adrian was in his crib, crying. His diaper had not been changed. There was no food prepared. No note on the counter. No sign of Vanessa anywhere in the apartment. I picked up my son, changed him, fed him what little I could find in the kitchen, and spent the next several hours calling Vanessa over and over. Every single call went straight to voicemail. My messages started calm and ended desperate. Finally, around 9 that evening, she called back. I will never forget the sound of her voice in that moment. Cold, distant. Like she was calling a stranger to cancel an appointment rather than calling the man she had promised to spend her life with. "Raymond," she said. I could hear music in the background, laughter, the sounds of someone else having a good time somewhere far away. We need to talk. Where are you? I asked. Adrian was on my hip, still fussing. Your son needs you. I need you. That is what I am calling about, she said. Those 6 words sent a chill straight through me. What followed was one of the shortest and most devastating conversations of my life. She told me she could not do it anymore, that she was tired of struggling, that she had found someone who could give her the life she deserved. Her voice did not shake. She did not cry. She spoke with the calm certainty of a person who had already made peace with a decision long before picking up the phone. I am sending you the divorce papers, she said. Sign them. I want nothing more to do with that child. I am done with this poverty, Raymond. I am done with all of it. The line went dead. I stood in that tiny living room, holding my baby son, staring at the phone in my hand, and I could not speak. I could not move. I could not make sense of what had just happened. This was not the woman I had married. This was not the woman who had cried tears of joy when Adrian took his first steps just 3 weeks earlier. This was not the woman who used to fall asleep on my shoulder talking about our future together. This was a stranger. The divorce papers arrived 2 weeks later. I refused to sign them at first. I held on to hope, foolish and desperate hope that she would come to her senses, that she would miss her son, that something inside her would wake up and bring her back to us. She never came back. Not once in all those months did she come to see Adrian. Not on his birthday, not when he was sick, not when he took his first unsteady steps across our living room floor, and I had nobody to call and share the moment with. She was gone as completely as if she had never existed. I held out for almost a year before I finally signed those papers. By then, I had stopped waiting. I had accepted what my life had become. I was going to raise my son alone. I want you to truly understand what that means. What it actually feels like to be a single father to a toddler when you were working 2 jobs and barely keeping the electricity on. It means waking up before dawn and dropping your child off at a neighbor's apartment before driving to a job that pays just enough to survive. It means rushing home after your day shift, making dinner, bathing your child, putting him to bed, and then driving back out to clean offices until midnight. It means falling asleep at the kitchen table with your coat still on because you do not have the energy left to make it to the bedroom. It means choosing, on more than one occasion, between buying groceries or paying the electric bill, and choosing your child every single time without a moment of hesitation. There were nights, I will not lie to you, when I would put Adrian to bed and then sit alone in the dark kitchen and cry. Not because I was weak, but because I was human. Because the weight of it was crushing and there was nobody to help carry it. Because I was terrified that no matter how hard I tried, I was failing him in ways I could not even see. I remember one particular winter when Adrian was about 3 years old. We were in a 1-bedroom apartment with a heating system that barely functioned. The cold came through the walls like it had a personal grudge against us. I would bundle him into every blanket we owned and hold him close through the night just to keep him warm. During the days when the apartment was too cold to stay in, I would take him to the public library. It was warm there, and it was free. We would spend hours in the children's section, sitting on the floor surrounded by picture books. Adrian loved the ones with bright colors and big illustrations, stories about brave knights and dragons and heroes who faced impossible odds and never gave up. One afternoon, he looked up at me from a picture of a knight on a white horse and said in that sweet, small voice of his, "Daddy, when I grow up, I'm going to be a knight and protect you from all the dragons." I had to look away so he would not see me cry. Those words gave me something no paycheck ever could. They gave me a reason. This little boy, who had never once complained about our small apartment, who had never asked why his mother was not there, who wore second-hand clothes without ever knowing they were second-hand. This little boy was my entire reason for existing. I worked construction during the days. I cleaned offices at night. There were times I had no choice but to bring Adrian with me to the night job because I simply could not afford a babysitter. He would curl up on a couch in one of the empty offices with his blanket and his stuffed bear tucked under his arm, and I would check on him every few minutes while I worked. My supervisor at the cleaning company was a woman named Mrs. Rodriguez. She had raised 5 children on her own and understood immediately what impossible choices looked like from the inside. "That boy is lucky to have you," she would tell me. "Not every man would step up the way you have." I never felt lucky. I felt tired and scared and completely alone. But I kept going, because that is what you do when someone needs you. You keep going, no matter what. When Adrian started school, I was so proud I could barely contain myself. He was sharp, sharper than I had ever been. His teachers praised him constantly. Curious, engaged, eager to absorb everything around him. I made sure he completed his homework every single evening, even when I barely understood the material myself. Mathematics had never been my strength, but I sat beside him at that kitchen table and learned right alongside him because I was not going to let my own limitations become his ceiling. Parent-teacher conferences were bittersweet occasions. I would sit in those tiny plastic chairs and listen to his teachers describe what a remarkable child he was, and I would feel this enormous swell of pride rising in my chest. But then I would look around at the other parents, mostly couples, dressed nicely, talking about vacation plans and weekend activities, and that familiar weight would settle back in. Was I enough? Was my best truly good enough for him? The years moved faster than I expected. Adrian grew from a chubby-cheeked toddler into a tall, confident teenager. He had my stubbornness and, unfortunately, something of his mother's restlessness. By the time he turned 18, I could already see the same recklessness in his eyes that I had once seen in Vanessa's. That constant searching quality, that hunger for something just beyond reach. I tried talking to him about responsibility, about focus, about building something real instead of chasing shortcuts. He would just flash that confident grin and say, "I got this, Dad. Stop worrying." He did not have it. But that chapter of the story belongs to another day. What I want you to carry away from everything I have shared with you today is something very simple. Something I repeated to myself on every dark night and every desperate morning for decades. Love is not a feeling. Love is a decision. A choice you make every single day, especially on the days when every part of you wants to give up and walk away. I chose Adrian every single day, even when it cost me everything I had, even when I had nothing left to give. And that choice, that stubborn, exhausting, beautiful choice, is what saved us both in the end. The hardest parts of my story had not even begun yet. I used to tell myself that I had done everything right. Every sacrifice I made, every night I worked until my hands were numb and my eyes burned from exhaustion, every meal I skipped so that Adrian could eat his fill, I told myself it was all building towards something, that every difficult day was laying a foundation for a better life, that when the time finally came, my son would stand on everything I had given him and reach heights I never could. I was wrong. Not about the sacrifices. Those were real, and they mattered, and I would make every single one of them again without hesitation. I was wrong about what they would produce, because somewhere in the space between everything I gave and everything Adrian received, something went off course. And by the time I could see it clearly enough to name it, it was already too late to stop what was coming. Adrian turned 18 in the spring of what I had hoped would be a turning point year. I scraped together enough money to take him to a proper sit-down restaurant for the first time in years. Nothing extravagant, just a decent place with real tablecloths and a menu that offered more than 5 options. I sat across from this tall, broad-shouldered young man who had somehow grown out of the little boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder in the library, and I felt a pride so deep it almost physically hurt. He had graduated high school despite everything we had been through. His grades were solid. His teachers respected him. The future felt wide open and full of possibility. But there was something in his eyes that evening that I did not want to look at directly. A restlessness that had nothing to do with ambition and everything to do with impatience. He wanted the good life. He wanted it immediately. Not through decades of quiet sacrifice the way I had pursued it. He wanted it fast, and he wanted it now. I should have addressed it that same night. I should have sat him down right there in that restaurant and spoken plainly about what I was seeing. But I convinced myself I was imagining things. I told myself that youth always looks like recklessness when viewed from the outside, and that he would find his footing with time. That was my mistake, and it cost all of us dearly. 6 months after his 18th birthday, I came home from work one evening to find a young woman sitting on the front steps of my apartment building. She was young 19 at the most, with tired, red-rimmed eyes and a swollen belly that told the entire story before a single word was spoken. Her name was Brianna. She stood up slowly when she saw me approaching, and I could tell she had been sitting there for a while. She had the look of someone who had been crying for several days straight. Not fresh tears, but the hollowed-out stillness that comes after everything has already been cried out, and all that remains is the decision. "Are you Adrian's father?" she asked. I said, "Yes." "I need to speak with him," she said. "He needs to know about this baby." I called Adrian at work and asked him to come home. When he arrived that evening, the three of us sat around the same small kitchen table where I had spent years helping him with homework, where we had shared hundreds of meals, where I had tried my best to pour everything I knew about life and responsibility into him. And we had the conversation I had been dreading from the moment I saw Brianna on those steps. She was 8 months pregnant. She wanted Adrian to step up, to be present, to be a father to the child they had created together. Adrian sat across from her with his jaw tight and his eyes fixed somewhere on the table between them, and all he kept saying was that he was not ready for this, that this was not part of his plan, that he could not handle a baby right now. I looked at my son in that moment, and something broke in me quietly, without drama. I saw Vanessa in him, not in his face, but in his posture, in the way he was pulling back from responsibility like it was something to be feared, in the way his eyes were already scanning for the nearest exit. "You should have thought about that before," I told him, and my voice came out harder than I had intended. He flinched, but his answer did not change. The baby was a little girl they named Aria. She came into the world with enormous dark eyes and tiny perfect hands, and absolutely no awareness of the storm surrounding her arrival. And instead of drawing Adrian and Brianna closer together the way I had hoped, Aria seemed to push them further apart with every passing week. Within months, Adrian was already involved with someone else. Brianna would show up at my apartment with the baby, exhausted and desperate, begging Adrian to spend even a small amount of time with his daughter, to help with the bills, to show up in any meaningful way at all. Adrian would make promises and then vanish. I watched this cycle repeat itself and felt a helplessness I had not experienced since those early years of raising him alone. I had taught him better than this. I knew I had. Every conversation we had ever had about responsibility, about showing up, about being the kind of man who does not walk away, where had all of it gone? Then one afternoon, Brianna came to my door alone. She was carrying Aria on her hip and there were tears on her face, but her voice was completely steady, the particular calm of someone who has already made a decision and is simply carrying it out. "Mr. Raymond," she said, "I cannot do this anymore. My mother asked me to leave. I cannot find work while taking care of a baby by myself. I have nowhere left to go." She paused and looked at me directly. "I know you raised Adrian right. Anyone can see that you are a good man. Would you take care of her? Just until I can get myself together?" I looked at little Aria on her hip. Aria looked back at me with those wide, dark eyes, completely unaware that her entire world was being rearranged in a doorway on an ordinary afternoon. What was I supposed to say? This child had done nothing wrong. She had not chosen her father's cowardice or her mother's desperation. She was innocent in every sense of the word. So I said yes. I took her in. And Brianna disappeared from our lives as completely and quietly as Vanessa had disappeared all those years before. I believe that was the end of it. I was wrong. 14 months later, a young woman named Sophia appeared at my door. She was carrying a baby boy she had named Cole. Same story, different face. Adrian had made her promises, gotten her pregnant, and moved on before the baby drew his first breath. I sat in my kitchen after she left and stared at the wall for a long time without moving. Then, 8 months after that, a third young woman knocked on my door. Her name was Jasmine, and her son was named Blake, 7 months old, with Adrian's stubborn chin and his restless eyes already visible in that tiny face. 3 women, 3 children, all abandoned. All eventually brought to my door because word had spread somehow among these young mothers that Raymond was a man who did not turn children away. By the time I was 55 years old, I was raising 3 grandchildren under the age of 4. Let me say that plainly, so it has the weight it deserves. 55 years old, 3 babies in a small apartment, working multiple jobs, stretching every dollar as far as it would go, and then stretching it further, The irony was not subtle, and it was not kind. I had given my entire adult life to ensuring my son had a better start than I did. I had sacrificed my health, my youth, my social life, my own dreams of what my future might look like. And here he was, making the exact same choices that Vanessa had made, running from responsibility, leaving broken pieces scattered behind him for someone else to gather up. That someone else was me. Again, I tried everything I could think of to reach Adrian. I tried calm conversation. I tried expressing my anger directly. I tried pleading. I tried silence. Nothing penetrated the wall he had built between himself and the consequences of his own choices. He would come by the apartment occasionally, usually to drop off a small amount of cash that he always presented as though it were far more than it actually was. He would hand me an envelope, glance briefly at the children playing on the floor around him, and seem genuinely puzzled by my lack of gratitude. One evening I decided to say everything I had been holding back. "Adrian," I said, and I used a tone he had not heard from me since he was a teenager doing something genuinely dangerous. "You cannot keep living this way. These are your children. They are not inconveniences. They are not consequences to be managed from a distance. They are human beings who need their father." He looked at me with those brown eyes that had once looked up at me with such complete and unguarded trust when he was small. But the trust was long gone. What had replaced it was something defensive and remote. "I am helping, am I not?" he said, holding up the envelope. "I send money. I show up when I can. What more do you want from me?" "I want you to be present," I said. "Not occasionally, consistently. I want you to show up the way a father is supposed to show up. I want you to be the man these children deserve." He laughed, but there was nothing warm in it. "Like you were there for me, working every hour of every day, always exhausted, always struggling, never actually around? I am giving these kids more than you ever gave me." Those words landed somewhere deep and quiet inside me. I did not answer right away. I let them sit there and breathe. "Everything I did," I said finally, keeping my voice as level as I could, "I did for you. Every job I worked. Every night I stayed up sitting beside your bed when you were sick. Every time I chose to buy you new shoes instead of repairing my car. Every single choice I made for 20 years of my life was made for you." But he was already moving toward the door. That was the moment I fully accepted the truth of my situation. Adrian was not going to change. Not yet. Perhaps not for a very long time. And in the meantime, there were 3 children in my apartment who needed consistency, stability, and love every single day, regardless of what their father chose to do. So I gave them that. All 3 of them. Every single day, without exception. Arya was brilliant from the very beginning. Sharp and curious and overflowing with questions about absolutely everything she encountered. By the time she was 4, she was asking me things I had to think carefully about before attempting an answer. She wanted to know how stars were made. She wanted to know why some families had more than others. She wanted to know where her daddy was. That last question was always the hardest one. Cole was pure, uncontained energy. He climbed on everything, ran everywhere, and seemed physically incapable of sitting still for longer than 30 seconds at a stretch. He had Adrian's boldness and his physicality, which was simultaneously endearing and completely exhausting to manage at my age. Blake was the quiet one. He would sit for long stretches of time with a notebook and a pencil, drawing pictures in careful detail. Always the same subject, our little family. 4 figures in every picture, me and the 3 of them, gathered around a table or standing in front of our building or sitting together in the park. He drew us together in every single picture, never apart, never missing anyone. I taught them what my own father had taught me. Respect, honesty, the dignity of hard work, the non-negotiable importance of showing up for the people who need you. I told them stories about their great-grandfather who had worked in the steel mills and never once complained even when his hands bled at the end of a shift. I told them that family was not simply the people you were born to. It was the people who chose to stay when staying was difficult. Every night after dinner, we would gather around that small kitchen table and I would help with whatever was needed. Homework, drawings, questions about the world, worries about school, and every night before bed, I would say the same thing to each of them. You are loved. You are safe. And tomorrow, we try again. It was not a perfect life. It was not even a comfortable life by most measurements, but it was ours. And in the middle of all the exhaustion and the financial strain and the constant low-level worry, there were moments of such pure and simple joy that I would catch myself thinking that perhaps this was exactly where I was supposed to be all along. And then, Adrian struck it rich. I want to tell you about the money and what it revealed about my son's character. I want to tell you about the woman who walked into our lives wearing elegance like a second skin and carrying a darkness that none of us could see yet. I want to tell you about the moment I realized that the worst chapter of my life had not yet been written. But before any of that, I want you to hold on to what I have shared with you today. 3 children were brought to my door, with nothing to offer except their existence and their need. No guarantees, no certainty about how any of it would turn out. Just the plain and undeniable fact that they were here and they needed someone to choose them. I opened that door every single time, not because I was without doubt or fear or exhaustion, not because I had some bottomless reserve of strength that other people lacked, but because I understood something that Adrian had not yet learned and that I pray he eventually would, that love is not something you feel when it happens to be convenient. It is something you practice every day, especially on the days when it costs you more than you think you have left to give. Those 3 children were going to cost me everything I had, and they were worth every single bit of it. Money changes people. I have seen it happen slowly, and I have seen it happen overnight, but I have never once seen it happen in a way that ends well for everyone involved. Money does not create character. It reveals it. It strips away the carefully maintained surface and shows you what was always underneath, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. And when Adrian's fortune arrived, what it revealed was a man who had never truly learned the lessons I had spent a lifetime trying to teach him. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how it happened. Adrian had always been naturally gifted with numbers. Even as a teenager sitting at our kitchen table doing his homework, he had an instinct for patterns and calculations that went beyond anything his teachers had formally shown him. Whatever the source of that ability, it was genuine and it was powerful. In his mid-20s, while I was raising his 3 children in that small apartment and stretching every dollar as far as it would go, Adrian had been quietly making investments on the side. Nothing dramatic at first. Small amounts placed carefully into technology companies, digital assets, and emerging markets that most people his age had never heard of. He was patient about it. In a way, he was patient about almost nothing else in his life. And then, one of those investments exploded. Within roughly 18 months, the returns multiplied in a way that seemed to defy ordinary logic. The kind of numbers that make experienced financial advisors look twice because they appear too good to be real. But they were real. Adrian went from living in a modest apartment across town to driving cars that cost more than most people's homes and wearing suits that were worth more than I made in a month of hard work. He moved into a mansion in the hills. I remember the first time he brought me to see it. I stood in that long paved driveway, looking up at this enormous house with its manicured lawns and its 3-car garage and its floor-to-ceiling windows catching the afternoon light, and I felt something complicated moving through me. Pride. Yes, genuine pride. My son had built something extraordinary from very little, and part of me recognized my own stubbornness and determination echoing in what he had achieved. But underneath the pride, there was fear. Because I knew Adrian, in the way that only a parent who has spent decades paying close attention to their child can truly know someone. I knew the part of him that ran from difficulty. I knew the part of him that had looked at 3 innocent children and treated them as problems to be managed rather than people to be loved. And I knew, with the quiet certainty of long experience, that this much money in those particular hands was going to cause damage before it caused anything good. I just did not yet know how much damage. For a period of time, Adrian began coming around more frequently, not to spend time with Arya, Cole, and Blake that would have required a change in him that had not yet happened. He came to discuss his investments, to ask for my perspective on what to do with his newfound wealth, to sit in my living room surrounded by his children's drawings and toys, and talk about offshore portfolios and real estate opportunities, as though the little ones playing at his feet were pieces of furniture he had learned to step around. I gave him the best advice I had. Buy property. I told him. Something real and tangible. Something that is genuinely yours and cannot disappear overnight. Do not pour everything into investments you do not fully understand. Build carefully. Build slowly. The things worth having always take longer than you want them to. He listened politely and ignored everything I said. He had professionals for all of that, he explained. Financial advisors, tax accountants, lawyers who specialized in exactly these situations. People who understood the details so that he did not have to concern himself with them. I should have pushed harder. I should have made him sit down and genuinely listen. But Adrian had inherited my stubbornness, along with everything else. And I had learned through painful experience that pushing too hard against that particular wall only made him dig in deeper. So I planted the seed and stepped back, hoping it would take root on its own. It never got the chance, because that was when Sophia entered his life. I will never forget the afternoon he brought her to meet me. He called ahead to say he was coming and that he had someone important with him, and I could hear something in his voice that I had not detected in years. Excitement was part of it. But underneath the excitement, there was something else. Something that sounded almost like relief. Like a man who has been searching without knowing exactly what he was looking for. And who believes he has finally found it. They arrived together, and when Sophia stepped out of the car onto the sidewalk in front of my building, I understood immediately why my son was captivated. She was stunning. There is simply no other word that fits. Tall and graceful, with the kind of effortless elegance that seems to exist independently of clothing or circumstance. She moved through space with the quiet confidence of someone who had never once in her life doubted her own value. She was the kind of woman whose presence changes the energy of a room the moment she enters it. I shook her hand, looked into her eyes, smiled, and said everything that the moment required. I was warm and welcoming, and genuinely tried to give her a fair first impression. But something happened in that initial moment of contact that I cannot fully explain even now. A feeling, not based on logic or any specific observation I could point to. The kind of feeling that does not come from the thinking part of a person, but from somewhere older and deeper, the part that has survived enough of life to recognize danger even when it arrives wearing a beautiful face. Something about Sophia made the hair on the back of my neck rise. I watched her as she moved through my small apartment. The way her eyes traveled across the worn furniture, the children's drawings taped carefully to the refrigerator door, the scuff marks on the kitchen floor. She was perfectly polite, her manners were flawless and beyond reproach. But underneath the politeness, I could sense something else. A constant, quiet assessment of everything around her. A calculating quality that never fully switched off. When she interacted with Arya, Cole, and Blake, she was careful and measured. Not unkind, she said the right things and smiled at the right moments. But there was no warmth behind any of it. No genuine interest. She moved around the children the way you might navigate around unfamiliar furniture in a room you do not plan to stay in long. When she stepped outside to take a phone call, I turned to Adrian. "She is beautiful," I said, choosing my words carefully. "But son, are you certain about this? You have not known her very long." He looked at me, and I saw something almost desperate in his expression. "I love her, Dad. She makes me want to be better, to finally settle down, to be genuinely responsible about my life." I wanted to believe him. I wanted it so desperately. The idea that this woman might be the thing that finally anchored my son, that she might be the force that made him into the father his children had been waiting for, was almost powerful enough to silence the warning that would not stop sounding somewhere in the back of my mind. Almost. But the feeling refused to leave. And I have learned over a long and difficult life that the feelings which refuse to leave are usually trying to tell you something important. They were married 6 months later. The ceremony was lavish and elaborate and expensive in a way that made my head swim. The venue alone probably cost more than I had earned across the previous 3 years combined. Every detail was perfect. The flowers, the music, the catering, the lighting, the photography. Sophia had very specific ideas about how everything should look and feel. And those ideas left precisely zero room for input from anyone outside her immediate circle. I was not involved in a single detail of the planning. My invitation arrived in the mail like any other guest. I sat in that beautiful church on the wedding day and watched my son make his promises to this woman, And I prayed with more sincerity than I had prayed for anything in years. I prayed that I was wrong about her. I prayed that she would bring out the best in him. I prayed that she would help him become the husband and father I had always believed he was capable of being. My prayers went unanswered. The change came immediately, and it was total. Within weeks of the wedding, Adrian stopped visiting the children. The financial support he'd been sending irregular and never quite enough. But something stopped arriving entirely. When I called him, he was always occupied, always in the middle of something more pressing, always pulled in a direction that had nothing to do with me or with the 3 children growing up in my apartment. "I am building a real life now, Dad," he told me during one of our increasingly rare phone conversations. "Sophia and I are creating something together, a genuine future." "What about Arya, Cole, and Blake?" I asked. "They are part of your future too. They always will be. They are being taken care of," he said. And I could hear Sophia's influence in the flatness of his voice, in the practiced dismissiveness, in the way he had learned to speak about his own children, as though they were administrative matters to be delegated. "You are doing a good job with them. They do not need me there." Arya was 7 years old and had started asking why her daddy never came to her school performances or her birthday celebrations. Cole, 5 years old and overflowing with unspent energy, kept asking when his father was going to teach him basketball the way he had repeatedly promised he would. Blake, just 4 years old, would stand at the living room window for long stretches of time, watching the street below with a patience that broke my heart, waiting for a car he recognized. How do you explain to a 4-year-old that his father has decided he is simply not important enough to show up for? How do you look into eyes that still hold the complete unguarded love that only very small children are capable of, and find words that are honest without being devastating? I did the best I could. I held them when they needed to be held. I answered their questions as gently and honestly as I was able. I told them that their father loved them even when his actions said otherwise, because I had to believe that somewhere underneath all the damage, it was still true. Then Sophia became pregnant. The news reached me from an unexpected direction. Vanessa, my ex-wife, the woman who had walked out on us when Adrian was barely old enough to form a complete sentence, called me without any warning one afternoon. Her voice carried the particular tension of someone trying to sound casual about something that was clearly eating at her from the inside. "Did you know?" she asked, skipping any greeting entirely. "Know what?" I said. "Adrian and Sophia. They are expecting a baby." I had not known. Adrian had not told me. I had learned about the impending arrival of my own grandchild from the woman who had abandoned his father before he was old enough to walk. The specific irony of that moment was difficult to breathe through. Vanessa seemed to expect some kind of solidarity from me, shared outrage at being left out of the announcement perhaps. Instead, I thanked her briefly for passing along the information and ended the call as quickly as I reasonably could. The baby was a boy. They named him Noah. And from the moment Noah arrived, Arya, Cole, and Blake ceased to exist in Adrian's world in any meaningful way. It was not gradual. It was not subtle. It was complete and immediate, like a door being shut and bolted from the other side. I attempted to visit them at their new residence. I wanted to meet my newest grandson and to find some way to reach my son before the distance between us became permanent and unbridgeable. But when I arrived at the entrance to their gated community, the security guard checked his approved list and shook his head slowly. My name was not on it. I showed him my driver's license, pointed out that Adrian and I shared the same last name, explained that I was his father. He made a phone call, spoke quietly into his radio, then turned back to me with the apologetic expression of a man delivering news that is not his fault and that he takes no pleasure in. "I am sorry, sir. You are not authorized to enter." I sat in my car outside those gates for a long time, not crying. I was past crying at that point, just sitting with the full weight of understanding that my son had locked me out of his life as deliberately and completely as if I were a stranger off the street. Over the months that followed, I gathered information through neighborhood connections and the occasional glimpse of social media posts that I would have preferred not to see. Adrian had reconnected with Vanessa. Sophia had encouraged it, had framed it as an important step toward becoming a more complete and settled person. So Vanessa, who had walked away from her infant son without a backward glance and never once returned to check on him, was now living in considerable comfort. Adrian was paying for her home, her vehicle, her travel, everything she had originally abandoned us in search of all those years ago. Meanwhile, I was still in my small apartment, still working, still raising 3 children who asked about their father every single day and deserved better answers than I was able to give them. The anger that lived in me during that period was unlike anything I had experienced before. Not hot and explosive, cold and steady. The kind that does not burn itself out because it has too much fuel and nowhere to go. But every time the anger threatened to overwhelm me, I would look at those children. Aria at her desk studying with fierce, quiet concentration. Cole running laps around the living room with his arms stretched wide. Blake sitting at the kitchen table adding tiny, careful details to one of his drawings. Always drawing us together. Always drawing our family whole. They were why I kept standing. They were why I got up every single morning. And they were about to become the reason I started asking questions that would put all of us in genuine danger. It started with a feeling. A small, persistent, quietly insistent feeling that something about Sophia's story did not hold together the way it should. That the picture being presented to the world was not the real picture underneath. That behind the elegance and the careful smiles and the gated property and the perfect constructed life, something was fundamentally and seriously wrong. I did not have evidence. I did not have proof. I could not have articulated the specific shape of my suspicion to anyone who asked. All I had was the feeling that had never left me from the first moment I shook her hand outside my apartment building on the day Adrian introduced us. And I had learned, over the full length of a long and difficult life, exactly what to do with feelings like that. I started paying attention, very close attention. And what I was about to discover would change everything for me, for my grandchildren, and for my son whose life was in far more danger than any of us yet understood. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with knowing something is deeply wrong but having no way to prove it to anyone who matters. It is not the loneliness of being physically alone. I had 3 children filling my apartment with noise and life and constant movement. I had neighbors who checked on us regularly. I had a community that had quietly become our extended family over the years. This was a different kind of loneliness entirely. The loneliness of carrying a suspicion that nobody else can see. Of moving through ordinary days with an extraordinary weight pressing down on your chest that you cannot explain to anyone because the moment you try, you sound like nothing more than a bitter old man who cannot accept that his son has chosen a different life. That was my existence during those months. Ordinary on the surface, quietly desperate underneath. I began paying attention to everything around me with a focus I had not applied to anything since those early years of raising Adrian alone, when survival itself had required that kind of sustained alertness. I noticed the small inconsistencies in the stories Sophia told about herself, the way certain details shifted slightly, depending on the audience. I noticed the way she spoke about Adrian's money, not with the careful respect of someone who understood what it had cost to earn it, but with the casual entitlement of someone who had always expected to have access to it and was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up with reality. And then there was Noah. I want to be careful here because Noah was an innocent child who deserved nothing from the world except love and protection and every possible chance at a good life. But I am committed to telling you the truth of what I experienced. And the truth is that the first time I saw a photograph of him posted on a social media account belonging to one of Adrian's former business associates, something stopped me completely cold. Noah did not look like Adrian. I know what you were thinking. Children do not always resemble their parents in obvious ways. Genetics are unpredictable. Features skip generations and recombine in unexpected configurations. All of that is true, and I understand it. But this was something different from ordinary genetic variation. It was not simply that Noah lacked Adrian's specific features. It was that the child looked like nobody in our family. Not Adrian, not me, not anyone I had ever seen connected to our bloodline in any capacity. He had light eyes, fine, straight hair, a distinctive bone structure in his face that was striking and unmistakable and completely foreign to everything I knew about the people I came from. I filed the observation away. I did not act on it immediately. I was aware that I already distrusted Sophia deeply, and I needed to be careful not to allow that existing distrust to manufacture evidence that was not genuinely there. I told myself to watch and wait and gather more before drawing any conclusions. But the feeling would not leave. I began making quiet inquiries around the edges of Adrian's world. Nothing that would attract attention. I was one older man with modest resources and no investigative training to speak of. But I had something that professional investigators sometimes lack, which is a lifetime of knowing how to talk to people, how to listen without appearing to listen, how to ask the right question at exactly the right moment and then remain silent long enough for the answer to naturally fill the space. I visited the places Adrian used to frequent before his marriage, his old neighborhood, the restaurants where he used to meet business contacts for lunch, a couple of bars downtown where I had heard from mutual acquaintances that he sometimes went alone to unwind after difficult weeks. Most people were reluctant to discuss him openly. His success had made him something of a local legend, and people tend to be protective of their legends. But I was patient, and persistence, in my experience, eventually opens every door that cannot be forced. A bartender at one of the clubs Adrian had frequented regularly told me that in the months before his marriage, my son had been a familiar and confident presence, sharp, always in motion, always talking about his next move. But in the final weeks before the wedding, something had shifted noticeably. He had come in alone on several occasions, drinking more heavily than anyone remembered him doing before, quieter than his usual self by a significant margin. Last few times I saw him before he got married, the bartender told me, wiping down the counter with the unhurried rhythm of someone who has absorbed thousands of other people's secrets over the years. He seemed like a man who had found something out and was still working through what it meant. Said something once about people never being who you think they are. Said he was going to get some tests done to settle something once and for all. Tests. The word dropped into my chest like a stone into still water, sending ripples outward in every direction. I thanked him and drove home slowly, my mind working carefully through everything I had gathered. By the time I pulled up outside my building, the picture forming in my head was one I did not particularly want to look at directly. But I had spent too many years of my life looking away from difficult truths and paying the price for it. I was finished with that particular habit. I needed to see Noah for myself. Getting access to the child was less complicated than I had feared. Sophia and Adrian maintained a predictable weekly routine. I had learned this through careful observation over several weeks of quiet watching. Part of that routine involved a young babysitter named Rosa who stayed with Noah on weekend afternoons, while Sophia ran her various errands and Adrian attended whatever social obligations Sophia had placed on their shared calendar. I drove out on a Saturday afternoon and waited at a discreet distance until I saw Sophia's car pass through the community gate heading outward. Then I drove to the entrance and asked the guard to call the house. I introduced myself as Noah's grandfather, which, if my suspicions turned out to be unfounded, I genuinely was, and after a brief exchange over the intercom, Rosa welcomed me inside. She was a warm and genuine young woman who seemed sincerely pleased that the baby's grandfather had come to visit. She told me that Sophia had shown her photographs of Adrian's family and that she recognized me from them. Noah was just waking from his afternoon nap when I arrived. Rosa brought him out and settled him on the living room floor with a collection of colorful toys, and I sat across from him and looked at him properly and carefully for the very first time. He was a beautiful child, alert and bright, with a wide, curious gaze that tracked everything moving in the room around him. He reached for a toy and laughed with delight when he successfully grabbed it, and the laugh was completely pure in the way that only very young children can manage uncomplicated by anything the world had not yet taught him. But as I sat watching him play, the feeling that had been sitting in my chest for months became something harder and colder than feeling. This child did not belong to my son. I could not have presented that knowledge to a judge or a jury in any form they would have accepted. But I knew it, with the bone-deep certainty that comes from decades of paying close attention to the world and to the people in it. While Rosa was occupied in the kitchen preparing his afternoon snack, I did something I am not proud of and would not advise anyone to replicate. I collected several strands of hair from the brush sitting on the side table near where Noah was playing. My hands were steadier than I expected them to be, given what I was doing and what it might mean. I left shortly afterward, thanking Rosa genuinely and asking her to let Sophia know I had stopped by for a visit. I drove back to my apartment with those few strands of hair sealed carefully in my jacket pocket, and I did not allow myself to think too directly about what I had just done until I was inside my own home with the door closed behind me. The DNA testing process turned out to be more straightforward than I had anticipated. There are companies that handle exactly this type of situation: mail-in kits, discreet processing, no questions asked. Results returned within 2 weeks. I submitted the samples along with a sample of my own, paid the fee using money I'd been setting aside from my paycheck over the course of 3 months, and settled in to wait. Those 2 weeks ranked among the longest of my entire life. I went through all the ordinary motions of every day caring for the children, going to work, preparing meals, sitting through homework sessions, getting everyone bathed and settled and into bed at night. But underneath all of it ran a constant current of tension that I could not switch off regardless of how tired I was or how much I wanted to simply rest. At night, I would lie awake in the dark, running through both possible outcomes. If the test returned showing a biological connection between Noah and myself, I would have to accept that I had been wrong about Sophia and find some way to make a quiet peace with a situation I could not change. If it came back showing no connection, then everything I had been suspecting for months was true, and I would face the far more difficult challenge of deciding what to do with that truth. The results arrived on a Tuesday morning. I waited until I had dropped the children at school before I sat down at the kitchen table and opened the envelope. I read through the results once, not fully trusting what I was seeing. Then I read them again, then a third time, moving through each line slowly and deliberately, making absolutely certain I understood what I was looking at. 0 probability of biological relation. Noah was not my grandson, which meant with complete certainty that Noah was not Adrian's son. I set the paper down on the kitchen table and sat completely still for a very long time. Outside the window, the city continued doing what cities always do, moving, making its noise. Running through another ordinary Tuesday morning without any awareness of what had just been confirmed in my small kitchen, Sophia had deceived my son in the most fundamental way possible. She had become pregnant by another man, convinced Adrian the child was his, married him to access his wealth, and then systematically dismantled every relationship in his life that might have given him the perspective to see what she was actually doing. She had separated him from his children, from his father. She had even orchestrated the return of the woman who had abandoned him as an infant, using Vanessa as another instrument to keep Adrian isolated within the carefully constructed world Sophia was building around him. The full scope of it was breathtaking in the most terrible way imaginable. I thought carefully and methodically about what my next move should be. Going directly to the police felt premature. What specific crime could I point to? Lying about paternity, as devastating as it is, carries no criminal penalty. Manipulation, however calculated and however destructive, does not constitute a prosecutable offense. I had DNA results obtained through means that were ethically questionable at minimum, and a collection of observations and suspicions that added up to a compelling picture, but not a case that any prosecutor would agree to take forward. I decided I needed to understand the full shape of what Sophia had built before I attempted to dismantle any part of it. That was when I drove out to the Malibu property for the first time, with the intention of observing rather than engaging. I parked a comfortable distance down the street on a weekday afternoon and settled in to wait. I gave myself an hour. What I witnessed in that hour altered everything. Around 3 in the afternoon, a car turned into the driveway. The man who stepped out was tall and athletic, with the same light eyes and fine straight hair I had seen on Noah's face. He moved with the relaxed ease of someone completely at home in his surroundings. He lifted Noah from a car seat and settled the boy on his shoulders, and the physical resemblance between them was immediate and overwhelming and beyond any reasonable dispute. This man was Noah's biological father. I did not need a laboratory to confirm what my eyes were telling me with absolute clarity. I watched them walk toward the front door. Sophia appeared in the entrance, and the man leaned down and kissed her, not the polite greeting of a friend or a family member, but the easy, intimate contact of two people who have been together for a long time and are completely comfortable in that familiarity. 6 months after my son's funeral, in the home that Adrian had purchased and paid for, I sat in my car and made myself breathe slowly and deliberately until the noise in my head quieted enough for clear thought to become possible again. His name, I established through careful research over the days that followed, was Victor. He and Sophia had been together for years before she ever encountered Adrian. They had been living together until approximately 6 months before Sophia and Adrian went on their first date. The timeline left no room for charitable interpretation. Sophia had been carrying Victor's child when she inserted herself into my son's life. She had executed her plan with a patience and precision that was almost clinical. But the question that had been circling at the edges of my thinking for weeks refused to stay quiet any longer. Had the accident that killed my son truly been an accident? I returned to the road where Adrian had died. I walked the stretch of asphalt carefully and slowly in full daylight, examining everything with eyes that were no longer prepared to accept the official conclusion without independent scrutiny. The road was genuinely dangerous, poorly lit, winding, with a documented history of serious accidents. But it was not on any direct route between Adrian's home and anywhere he regularly went. It was remote and out of the way. What had brought him there that night? Approximately a quarter-mile from the crash site, I found something that stopped me where I stood. Tire tracks leading off the paved road and into a small, cleared area among the trees. The tracks were weathered and aged, consistent with the time frame of Adrian's accident. Someone had pulled off the road and parked in that clearing, a position that offered a direct line of sight to the precise stretch of road where my son's car had left the pavement. Someone had been waiting there. I stood in that clearing for a long time while the trees were quiet around me, and the road beyond was empty. And the picture I had been assembling piece by careful piece over months of patient work suddenly locked into focus with a clarity so sharp it made me physically ill. They had killed him. Not a tragic accident on a dangerous road in the dark. A murder, planned deliberately and executed carefully by two people who had calculated that the insurance money and the inherited wealth were worth more than my son's continued existence. Two people who had decided to act before Adrian could get any closer to the truth they were desperately concealing. I drove home that evening carrying knowledge I could not prove and could not share. Knowing that the woman living in that Malibu property with her real partner and her stolen future had murdered my son as intentionally as if she had made the choice herself. And knowing, with absolute certainty, that I had to find a way to make them answer for it. 2 weeks after that afternoon in the clearing, a certified letter arrived in my mailbox from a financial institution I had never heard of. I almost did not open it. The volume of difficult correspondence I had been receiving during that period, legal notices, collection attempts, overdue bills had conditioned me to brace myself before opening anything official looking. I sat at the kitchen table holding the envelope for a full minute before I finally broke the seal and removed the single page inside. I read it once and did not understand what I was seeing. I read it a second time and still could not make the numbers resolve into something my mind was willing to accept. I read it a third time, word by careful word, giving each sentence the full weight of my attention. The letter informed me that I was the sole and exclusive beneficiary of a trust account that had been formally established in my name. The account had been created 2 years prior by my son, Adrian. The funds were currently in a mandatory restriction period and would become fully and freely accessible in 6 months from the date of the letter. The balance held in trust was $35 million. I set the letter down on the table in front of me. Outside the window, Blake was sitting on the front steps with his notebook, adding details to whatever he was working on. Inside the apartment, Aria was at her desk, studying with the focused intensity she brought to everything academic. Cole was somewhere in the back of the apartment, producing the specific quality of noise that meant he was either engaged in enthusiastic play or in the early stages of breaking something. My ordinary evening, my careful, difficult, ordinary life, and somewhere in a bank I had never walked into, my son, who was supposed to be dead, had left me $35 million. I picked the letter up and read it one final time. Then I folded it precisely along its original creases, returned it to its envelope, and placed it in the inside breast pocket of my jacket, directly against my chest. I told no one. Not that evening. Not for a long time afterward. Because something in me, the same instinct that had kept me functional through decades of impossible situations, was telling me clearly that knowledge of this money was dangerous. That the wrong people learning about it too soon would put me and the 3 children in my care at risk in ways I was not equipped to manage alone. So, I kept the secret close. I maintained my ordinary life. I went to work. I helped with homework. I made meals and read bedtime stories and got up every morning and did it all over again. And I waited. But fate has never once operated on a schedule that suited my preferences. and the truth that was coming toward all of us was larger and more extraordinary than anything I had yet imagined. Far larger. There is something that happens to a person when they have been carrying too many secrets for too long. It does not announce itself dramatically. It does not arrive all at once in a single, overwhelming moment. It comes gradually and quietly. The way water works its way through solid stone, so slow and so patient that you do not notice the erosion until one day you look down and realize the ground beneath your feet has fundamentally and permanently changed. I have been carrying multiple secrets for months by that point. The DNA results folded and stored where no one would find them. The tire tracks in that forest clearing that told a story the official investigation had never considered. The $35 million sitting untouched in a bank account with my name on it. Each secret pressing down on me with its own specific weight, and all of them together forming a burden that was beginning to affect everything: my sleep, my appetite, my ability to be fully and genuinely present for the 3 children who needed me more than anyone else in the world. Something had to move. I just did not yet know in which direction. The answer came from somewhere I did not expect. I was driving back from the grocery store on an ordinary Thursday afternoon when I saw her. Vanessa, standing outside a lawyer's office in the downtown area, looking nothing like the polished and comfortable woman I had glimpsed in photographs, living her carefully arranged new life alongside Sophia in that Malibu property. She looked disheveled in a way I had never seen her look. Even during our most difficult years together, her eyes were red and swollen. Her shoulders carried the specific curve of someone who has been completely defeated by something and has not yet located the energy to straighten back up. I pulled over without thinking about it and got out of the car. She looked up when she heard the door and seemed genuinely startled to find me standing there in front of her. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We had not been in the same physical space in years, and the accumulated weight of everything that had passed between us and because of us and despite us hung in the air between us like a presence of its own. "Can we talk somewhere?" she asked finally. Her voice was quieter than I remembered it. "Somewhere private. There are things you need to know, Raymond. Things I should have told you a long time ago." We walked around the corner to a small diner and sat across from each other in a booth by the window. Vanessa wrapped both hands around a coffee cup like she needed something solid to hold on to and stared at the table surface for a long time before she began. What she told me added an entirely new dimension to everything I thought I already understood about what had been done to my son. She had trusted Sophia. That was how she framed it, as a failure of her own judgment rather than purely as a crime committed against her, which told me more than she perhaps intended to reveal. Whatever Sophia had done to Vanessa, it had been thorough enough to make her feel genuinely complicit in her own betrayal. After Adrian's funeral, Sophia had approached her with a carefully constructed proposition. They were both grieving, Sophia had said. They were both family in their own ways. They should support each other through the loss and work together to ensure that Adrian's estate was handled properly, with both of them receiving what they rightfully deserved. Vanessa had agreed. She had also, at Sophia's specific direction, told me that Adrian had died with essentially nothing, that his entire lifestyle had been financed through debt and credit, that there was no meaningful estate and no assets worth pursuing. It had been a lie, constructed specifically and deliberately to keep me quiet and keep me from asking questions that might have led somewhere dangerous for Sophia and Victor. She promised me 50% of everything, Vanessa said, still not quite meeting my eyes directly. Once the legal process was complete, once everything was properly settled and transferred, we were going to divide it equally between us. "What happened?" I asked, though part of me had already worked out the answer. She cut me out completely. The bitterness in her voice was raw and very recent. Once she had full control of everything, the accounts she knew about, the insurance policies, the investments she had identified, she told me I was entitled to a small monthly payment and nothing beyond that. When I told her I would challenge her in court, she reminded me that I had lied to you about the assets. Vanessa finally lifted her eyes to mine. She told me that if I caused any trouble at all, she would make certain that everyone learned what I had done, that I had abandoned my son as an infant and only returned when I could smell money. I sat with that for a moment and let it settle. The architecture of it was almost elegant in its cruelty. Sophia had recruited Vanessa as an instrument. used her effectively, and then neutralized her by turning her own guilt into a weapon pointed directly at her. She had anticipated exactly what leverage would guarantee silence and had deployed it without hesitation. "There is something else," Vanessa said. She glanced around the diner briefly, then lowered her voice. "Sophia and Victor are planning to leave the country. They have been moving money into overseas accounts for months now. Raymond, they are going to take Noah and disappear. It is not something they are considering. It is something they are actively preparing for. It will happen soon. Within the next few weeks at the most." The coffee in front of me had gone completely cold. I had not touched it once. "How soon exactly?" I asked. "I do not know the specific date, but soon, very soon." I called Detective Williams that same evening and relayed everything Vanessa had shared with me. He listened with the careful attention of someone who takes information seriously, but his response carried the particular caution of a man who has learned through experience not to promise more than the available evidence can actually support. "Without something concrete," he said, "there is genuinely very little I can do to prevent two people from traveling internationally. People relocate abroad legally every single day, and there is no mechanism to stop them without cause." I understood. Understanding did not make sitting with it any easier. That night, after I had gotten all 3 children fed and bathed and settled into bed, after the apartment had gone quiet around me, I sat at the kitchen table and spread everything I had gathered across its surface. The DNA results, the photographs I had taken of the tire tracks in the forest clearing, the notes I had made during months of patient investigation, the certified letter about the trust fund with its extraordinary number printed in plain black ink. I looked at all of it arranged in front of me on that small table. The same table where I had helped 3 children with their homework for years, where I had eaten thousands of solitary meals, where I had made every significant decision of the past several years of my life. And I made one more decision. I drove to Malibu the following morning. I want to be honest with you about my state of mind during that drive. I was not calm. I was not operating from a place of strategic clarity. I was a man who had spent decades absorbing loss and continuing forward regardless, and I had finally reached the absolute limit of what quiet endurance could accomplish. I needed to stand in front of Sophia and say out loud what I knew. Whatever came after that moment, I could not allow her to simply walk away from what she had done to my son without at least one person looking her in the eye and saying it plainly. The morning light falling across the property made it look different than it had during my previous visits. Less impressive, more like an elaborate stage set constructed to suggest a life rather than actually contain one, which, I supposed, was precisely what it was. I parked in the driveway, walked to the front door, and rang the bell. Sophia answered within moments. She was already impeccably dressed for the day, her composure in perfect order, and the expression that moved across her face when she recognized me transitioned from surprise to something harder and more guarded so rapidly that I would have missed it entirely if I had not been watching for exactly that kind of micro-face. "Adjustment. Raymond," she said, "this is not a good time." "I imagine it is not," I said. "I need to speak with you regardless." She began to say something about scheduling something for another day, and I spoke directly over her without raising my voice. "I know that Noah is not Adrian's biological son," I said. "I know that you and Victor have been together since, well before you ever met my son. I know about the life insurance policy you took out on Adrian 6 months before he died. And I know that what happened on that road was not any kind of accident." The color left her face with a speed that was almost startling. But Sophia was not a woman who collapsed under pressure. She recovered within seconds, reassembling her composure around herself like armor being fitted back into place. "You are completely delusional," she said. Her voice was flat and controlled and betrayed nothing. "And if you do not remove yourself from my property immediately, I'm going to contact the police." "Please do," I said. "Call them right now. Tell them everything. Tell them about the insurance policy. Tell them about the offshore accounts. Tell them about Victor, who has been living in this house since before my son was in the ground." Something shifted in her expression. Not guilt. I had come to believe that Sophia was not genuinely capable of guilt in any meaningful sense. What shifted was her internal calculation, a rapid reassessment of exactly how much I knew, and what it might realistically mean for the plans she and Victor had been carefully executing. "Your son abandoned his children," she said carefully, shifting her approach. "He abandoned you. Whatever you think of me, he was not the man you believed him to be. He was exactly the man I raised him to be," I said. "Flawed, stubborn, capable of serious mistakes, but also capable of genuine love. And you identified that capacity in him and used it against him from the very beginning." Victor appeared in the doorway behind her. I had not heard him approach. He was even larger in person than the distance of my previous observations had suggested, and he looked at me with the measuring expression of a man assessing a physical situation and calculating his options. "You need to leave," he said, quietly. The kind of quiet that is meant to sound more threatening than shouting. "I will leave," I said, holding his gaze steadily. "But I want both of you to understand something clearly. I know what you did, and I want you to know that I know." Victor took a single step forward. I did not move. Something in my absolute stillness made him pause and recalculate. And in that suspended moment, we all heard a voice that did not belong to any of us. "Would someone like to explain to me what exactly is happening out here?" I turned around, and the world as I understood it stopped functioning entirely. Standing in the driveway behind me, with a faint scar above his left eyebrow that had not been there before, and a wariness in his eyes that had replaced the old familiar recklessness, was my son, Adrian, alive and standing in front of me. I cannot find adequate words for what happened inside me in that moment. There are experiences that exist entirely beyond the reach of language, and seeing your child standing in front of you after you have buried him and grieved him completely, and reorganized your entire understanding of the future around his permanent absence, that is one of them. I had mourned him. I had sat with 3 children through the specific and devastating agony of losing a parent. I had learned to speak of him in the past tense. I had accepted as fully as a person can accept such a thing, that he was gone. And he was standing in a driveway in Malibu looking at me like he was the one who was confused about what was happening. "Dad," he said, "what are you doing here?" Behind me, I heard Sophia's voice for the first time stripped of every layer of careful control she had maintained since the moment I met her. "You are supposed to be dead," she whispered. Adrian looked past me at her, with an expression I had genuinely never seen on his face before. Completely cold, completely deliberate, entirely without warmth or mercy, or any trace of the love he had once believed he felt for her. "I know you believe that," he said. We went inside. I am still not entirely certain how my legs carried me through that door. We settled in the living room, the same space I had broken into weeks earlier. The same expensive furniture and carefully chosen artwork, paid for with money taken from my son. And Adrian told us what had really happened on the night he was supposed to die. He had been growing suspicious of Sophia for months before that night. Small inconsistencies in her accounts of herself, financial movements he could not trace or account for satisfactorily. The systematic removal from his life of every person who might have helped him think more clearly about what he was living inside. And then there was Noah, growing and developing and becoming more distinctly himself with every passing month and looking nothing like Adrian from any angle or in any light. He had arranged a private DNA test through a laboratory that guaranteed complete discretion. The results had been delivered to him on the afternoon of the night. Everything changed. He had sat alone with those results for several hours, understanding not simply that Noah was not his biological son, but the full implications of what that meant, the marriage built on deception, the money being systematically redirected, the isolation from everyone who might have warned him earlier. He confronted Sophia that evening, told her he was going to his lawyer to initiate divorce proceedings, told her he was filing fraud charges, told her he was going to expose everything she had constructed, piece by piece, until none of it was standing. Then he went to his car. When I reached for the door, Adrian said, his voice steady and quiet in the way of someone recounting something that still lives very close beneath the surface, I noticed something attached under the dashboard, a small device, placed carefully and deliberately. If I had not already been in the state of mind I was in that evening, alert to everything, trusting nothing, I might have missed it entirely. He paused for a moment, I had approximately 30 seconds to make a decision. He ran. Into the darkness at the roadside. Into the trees, as far and as fast as he could push himself. The explosion knocked him completely off his feet and left him unconscious. When he opened his eyes, the sirens were already audible in the distance. And lying on cold ground in the dark with smoke thickening the air above the road, he made the decision that saved his life. He stayed dead. If Victor was willing to do it once, Adrian said, he would do it again without hesitation the moment he had any reason to believe I had survived. I needed distance. I needed time. And I needed evidence, real evidence, gathered properly. The kind that could not be bought off or explained away in a courtroom. He had spent the following year in a cabin belonging to a trusted friend in the mountains, monitoring everything through surveillance equipment he had quietly installed throughout the Malibu property months earlier, back when his suspicions were still forming, and he was still hoping desperately that he was wrong about everything he was beginning to suspect. He had recorded everything. Every conversation between Sophia and Victor about distributing the insurance payout. Every discussion of the offshore accounts and the timeline for leaving the country. Every moment of careless honesty that people permit themselves when they are absolutely certain no one is listening. He placed a thick envelope on the coffee table between us. Bank records, insurance documents, detailed phone records from the night of the accident. Hours of recorded conversations in which Sophia and Victor described in their own words exactly what they had done and precisely why they had done it. And he had not made this trip alone. The front door opened behind us, and Detective Williams walked through it, accompanied by 4 uniformed officers. Adrian had contacted him. The trial that followed became a significant media event. The evidence was overwhelming in both its volume and its specificity. The recorded conversations were particularly devastating. Hearing Sophia and Victor discuss what they had done in their own voices, in their own words, with the casual confidence of people who believed they were completely safe, left the jury with nothing meaningful to deliberate about. Both were convicted on every charge presented against them. Sophia received 25 years to life for conspiracy and fraud. Victor received 30 years to life for the attempted murder, having been the one who physically constructed and placed the device in Adrian's car. Neither of them would see genuine freedom again before they were very old, if they ever did at all. During the proceedings, the full history of their operation was revealed to the court. Victor had done this before. A previous wife of his had died in what had been officially ruled an accidental drowning several years earlier. The insurance payment from her death had provided the initial funding for everything that followed. These were not impulsive or opportunistic criminals. They were patient and methodical, and they had rehearsed on someone else before they ever identified my son as their next subject. Vanessa learned about Adrian's survival through the news coverage surrounding the arrest and trial. She contacted him, and he responded with the directness and clarity of a man who has been through enough to be finished with comfortable fictions. He told her that she had walked away from him when he was an infant and had returned only when she believed there was money within reach. He wished her no specific harm, but he owed her nothing, and he intended to give her nothing. Her legal representatives confirmed what she already understood. She had no standing to claim any portion of her adult son's estate. She returned to whatever life she had been constructing before Sophia recruited her into the scheme, smaller and quieter and less comfortable than she had imagined it becoming. Bringing Adrian home to Aria, Cole, and Blake was the single most extraordinary moment of my life. I include the day he was born in that comparison, and I mean it without qualification. I called Mrs. Henderson from the car, and she came immediately, letting herself into the apartment to be with the children while I brought Adrian up. Then we rode the elevator together. Adrian carrying Noah, me carrying 70 years of everything I had survived and sacrificed and refused to surrender, and I opened the apartment door and called out that I had brought someone home to see them. Aria, Cole, and Blake looked up from the television with the mild and ordinary curiosity of children expecting to see a familiar neighbor. Then they saw their father standing in the doorway. The silence lasted perhaps 2 full seconds. Aria's lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then she whispered his name, just the single word, barely audible across the room, and all 3 of them were moving at once, running and crying and laughing simultaneously in the way that children do when the emotion is simply too large and too complex to come out as any single thing. Adrian dropped to his knees in the middle of that small living room and gathered all 3 of them into his arms at the same moment and held on with everything he had. Cole pulled back just far enough to look at his father's face with a 5-year-old's complete and serious scrutiny.
"We had a funeral for you," he said. "There were flowers and everything."
"I know," Adrian said. "I am so sorry. Are you really actually here?" Blake asked, pressing both small hands against his father's face like he needed the physical confirmation before he would allow himself to believe it. "Or are you a ghost who just looks like you?" "I am really here," Adrian said. His voice was not entirely steady. "And I am never leaving any of you again." He kept that promise. Every single day, from that moment forward, he kept it. The $35 million did exactly what Adrian had set it aside to do. It moved us out of that small apartment and into a real home, with enough space for everyone and a yard where the children could run and a kitchen table large enough for the whole family to sit around together without anyone being left out. It established education funds for all 4 children that would carry them as far as their ambitions were willing to take them. It allowed us to support causes we believed in and to help other families in our community who were struggling the way we had struggled through so many of our years. The money was good to have. I will not pretend otherwise or make it sound like it did not matter. But it was not what made us wealthy. What made us wealthy was something that had been building through every difficult year, every impossible choice, every morning I got up when getting up was the last thing I felt capable of doing. It was Aria becoming the kind of student whose teachers sought her out specifically to challenge her because ordinary assignments could not hold her attention. It was Cole discovering that he had musical ability to match his athletic energy and throwing himself into both with equal and unstoppable enthusiasm. It was Blake's drawings evolving from those careful 4-figure family portraits into artwork that genuinely stopped people when they saw it displayed on our walls. It was Adrian entering therapy without anyone pushing him toward it, because he understood that surviving something and healing from it are entirely different processes, and that his children deserved a father who had done both. It was watching him sit with Aria's anger and Cole's confusion and Blake's quiet grief without flinching or deflecting or looking for the exit. It was seeing him show up not occasionally, not when it was convenient, but every single day, for every homework session and every bedtime, and every ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday evening when showing up, simply meant being present. Noah adapted slowly, with the steady support of counselors who understood what he had experienced and did not rush the process. He had known Sophia and Victor as his parents, and their sudden disappearance from his life was genuinely traumatic regardless of who they had actually been and what they had actually done. But children possess a capacity for adaptation that consistently exceeds what adults predict, and with the consistency of a family that was not going anywhere and did not intend to, he found his footing and then his place. Biology is not what makes a family, Adrian told me one quiet evening, as we sat together on the back porch watching all 4 children play in the yard below us, the sounds of their laughter rising up through the warm air. Showing up is what makes a family. I looked at him for a long moment. This man who had traveled so far from where he had started, who had been shaped by his worst impulses and very nearly destroyed by someone else's calculated evil, and who had come through the other side of both, with his eyes fully open for what seemed like the very first time. "That is something I have been trying to explain to you for most of your life," I said. He smiled, the real smile, the one that had belonged to the little boy in the library, reaching for picture books about brave knights. "I know, Dad. I should have listened about 30 years earlier." "Yes," I said simply. "You should have." We sat together in the quiet of that evening, and I let myself feel without qualification or reservation what I had not allowed myself to feel in a very long time: peace. 2 years after Adrian came home, he met Sarah, a pediatric nurse with a steadiness about her that expressed itself not in dramatic gestures but in small, consistent actions. The kind of person who shows up quietly and does what needs doing without needing to be acknowledged for it. She met the children early in the relationship and approached them with the patient, genuine interest of someone who understands that trust between children and adults is built slowly and cannot be manufactured or rushed. They married in a ceremony in our backyard. No elaborate venue hired for the occasion. No guest list assembled for appearances. Just the people who had genuinely been present through everything. Mrs. Henderson in her good dress in the front row. The teachers who had helped our children through the hardest years, the neighbors who had become family long before they were ever called that, the counselors who had sat with us through the healing. When Sarah became pregnant, the children received the news with the particular quality of joy that belongs to people who have learned through hard experience not to take good things for granted. They helped prepare the nursery and argued passionately about names and made elaborate detailed plans for everything they personally intended to teach the baby about the world. Our Sunday dinners became the organizing ritual around which our family's life arranged itself. Every week, the table fills with children and grandchildren and friends and neighbors and members of our community who have become woven so thoroughly into what we are that calling them guests would feel like a misrepresentation. Mrs. Henderson comes every week without exception, and every week she marvels at how completely different everything looks from those years when she would come over to watch 3 grieving children in a small apartment, while I drove across the city in the dark, trying to find a truth that no one else was looking for. I am 70 years old now, officially retired, though I have never in my life been busier. My days are filled with grandchildren and with volunteering at a community center that provides practical support to single-parents people who are standing right now where I was standing 30 and 40 years ago, working 2 jobs, raising children alone, wondering in the small hours of the night whether they are enough for the people depending on them. I tell them what I know. I tell them that they are enough, that the fact of their continued presence, the fact that they are still standing, still choosing their children every morning, still showing up despite everything working against them, is not a small or ordinary thing. It is the most important thing. Everything else is secondary to that. The money's ge da pied, ge doisters, ge duver, ge duas ge b1, ge duas covers. Ge during serves its purpose well. The children's futures are secured in ways I could not have imagined during those years of stretching every dollar past its breaking point. We help families in our community who are struggling the way we struggled. It is genuinely good to have it, and I am grateful for it every day. But it is not the source of what we actually have. What we actually have was built through 30 years of refusing to stop, through 3 children brought to my door with nothing but their existence and their need, who grew into people of genuine substance and character, through a son who came back from the dead, changed in every way that actually mattered, through a family that was broken into pieces more times than I have counted and put itself back together every single time because the people inside it would not accept any other outcome. Real wealth is a child running to find you when they are frightened, because they know without question that you will be there. Real wealth is watching your son become the father you spent decades believing he could be. Real wealth is sitting on a porch on a quiet evening, listening to the sounds rising from a house that is genuinely full of people who love each other and who know, with the bone-deep certainty that only comes from having nearly lost everything, that they are loved in return. That is what I have. That is what all of it was for. And I would live every difficult, exhausting, heartbreaking, magnificent moment of it again without changing a single thing. Because that is what love is. Not the feeling you have when everything is easy, the decision you make every day when nothing is, the choice to stay when leaving would be so much simpler. The refusal to stop believing in the people you love, even when they have given you every reason to walk away. That is the only kind of love that builds anything worth having, and it is worth absolutely everything it costs.